Pride/Prejudice, Chapter 4, Segment 2. Elizabeth slept little that night, less even than her sister. She had heard of men who did not like women, but the implications behind the phrase could never have been made so clear to her as in tonight's impromptu tableau. A man who did not like women was also a man who did like men, in a way he should not. Why the one should follow from the other, Elizabeth had not understood until now, despite all her humorous words on the subject. There was one incident she had not related to Jane, one piece of evidence she had left out, because it did not help her cause, but rather contradicted her argument. It had happened after dinner, while Jane and Mr. Bingley sat a little apart from the others, engrossed in their own low-voiced talk. Miss Bingley had invited Elizabeth to join her in walking around the parlour, an obvious ploy to give the gentlemen, or one in particular, a full view of their forms that sitting at a table could not provide. Ordinarily, Elizabeth would never take part in such a vulgar scheme, but there was no one to be modest before. Mr. Hurst was a nonentity, a fribble, a man of fashion, whose concerns encompassed nothing beyond food and cards. Mr. Bingley cared for no one but Jane. Elizabeth felt certain she could disrobe in front of him and fall backward onto a sofa with her legs in the air, and he would merely inquire whether her sister was feeling better. No, it was only this woman-hating Mr. Darcy they would be attempting to beguile, as Miss Bingley well knew. Elizabeth stood up, suddenly all too conscious of the man's eyes on her, and resolving to be brave, linked arms with Miss Bingley and paraded up and down the room. Mr. Darcy, lest she should miss any of the connotations of her action, remarked that he knew full well why the ladies walked, a comment totally unnecessary unless to inform Elizabeth that she was the object of his interest. Miss Bingley, unsurprisingly, blundered happily into the snare, querying Mr. Darcy as to his mysterious meaning, destroying any gains from Elizabeth's deliberate silence. Elizabeth could not recall the rest of the conversation. Her head swam with the consciousness of his eyes on her until she felt like a veiled odalisque displayed before a fastidious Oriental sultan searching out replacements for his depleted seraglio. It was such an effort to regain her composure that she had an overwhelming desire to pierce and draw blood in recompense. Bad enough to refer obliquely in the ensuing discussion to the vices of pride and vanity, but she had not stopped there. When he denied the latter and made a virtue out of the former, "Mr. Darcy has no defect," she said, sinking to the level of insolence. "He owns it himself without disguise." She sensed his recoil and was abashed, but could not take the words back, nor would she if given the chance. He had behaved almost as badly when Mrs. Hurst played on the pianoforte, suggesting with unbecoming slyness that Elizabeth was so moved by the lively tune that she must wish to dance a reel. What if she had been incautious enough to agree? Considering his lack of courtesy at that first Meryton assembly, it seemed a calculated insult. Or had he already forgotten that insignificant event? How could he love his friend to the rejection of all others, and yet watch her so closely? How could he hate women, and yet admire her? What did it mean to hate women? Whatever he was, he hated women's minds and natures, not their bodies, at least not her body. Just as she felt about him, he was odious, overbearing, arrogant, and beautiful, and amusing, an opponent worthy of her skill. Oh, he was far above her slight talents, and impervious to anything she could say to wound him, but at least she had someone to joust with, someone she could not defeat on the first try. It would be bad enough if it was just a physical attraction that had sprung up, so quickly conceived and as quickly dispelled with the revelation of weak character or deficient wit. But this was dangerous. He was like a sleek, muscular tiger, something with claws and sharp teeth that must be left alone, while all the time one's hand was reaching out, tempted to stroke the striped coat, only to be bitten off. He knew exactly the effect he had on all women apparently, and scorned them all. That was some comfort, at any rate, that he had as great a contempt for his friend's snobbish, rude sisters as for her. After his dismissal of her at the Meryton Assembly as not handsome enough to tempt me, Elizabeth had been very glad to give him no more reason to find her lacking. When Sir William Lucas, hosting his own gathering, had tried to pair them for a dance, she had refused on principle, and apparently done herself some good, because the hateful man had not pressed. Why, then, did she care that he noticed her here at Netherfield? She should stay out of sight, keep quiet, instead of answering his acerbic witticisms with her own, as close to impertinence as she had ever come with anyone. She knew he liked it, knew he had never been spoken to in that way. Elizabeth was certain now. They must leave this house, but only to gain reinforcements, waging the war for Mr. Bingley's liberation and Jane's happiness from their own camp. It could all work out very well. Mr. Bingley was announcing his intentions to set up his own establishment. He and Jane were a perfect match, in age, in temperament. Anyone could see that. Even Mr. Darcy would be forced to recognize that the time had come to let his friend decide this matter for himself. It might not have to mean the end of their friendship, after all. Why should he not love a married man as well as a single one? Only he would have to share, that's all. She must help Jane in her struggle, should they face a whole legion of Mr. Darcys. She shuddered, suddenly in a cold sweat every bit as bad as Jane's, at the image of a battalion of tall, fair, handsome, proud men, advancing in line across like soldiers on the field of battle, but instead of muskets levelled ready to fire, they had their breeches open and— What was the matter with her? When had she ever thought in such lewd images? Never, but only because she had never before seen anything to inspire them. And there had never been anyone worth thinking lewdly about. She had never felt it, this reaction to a man's face or voice, this strange tightness between her thighs, this wetness. She would not let herself become as pathetic as Miss Bingley.